Thank you so much, Andrew. Look, it's an absolute pleasure to always be involved with anything that Wadham is doing, but particularly when it's on topics that are very close to my heart, and living through the most recent bushfire crisis here in Australia and so closely on its tail now dealing with the coronavirus imminent pandemic. It's been very interesting times for those of us working in disaster and emergency response. So it's a delight to be able to talk to you all today, and I thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to listen in. I'd just like to start firstly by acknowledging this pretty magnificent photo that I have here on my front slide. It was taken by who's quickly become one of my favourite photographers, and he often laughs when I said that. Jacob is a volunteer firefighter here in the state of Victoria in Australia, where I'm from. And in the middle of the bushfire crisis, he was one of the volunteer brigades that was sent out to some of the front lines that were fastly approaching and encroaching on various communities within our state. And this particular photograph was taken near Mount Hotham, which for those of you here in Australia and anyone who has visited the region will recognise as being one of our main tourist areas, particularly when it comes to the ski season. And it was a particularly hot day when they were actually sent out to prepare and respond to these particular fires that were encroaching around Mount Hotham. And they were seeking out some shade on a private residence. And so you can see here one of Jacob's colleagues, Kristen, taking shelter under a bit of a wooden awning with that awesome view ahead of just exactly what they were all up against in terms of what these fires looked like. And we need to be really mindful that here in Australia, overwhelmingly, we rely on our volunteer workforce when it comes to both responding to and recovering from disaster. So many of these people who were faced with this were not only volunteers, but first-time volunteers. This was the first bushfire many of them had ever responded to. And this was the kind of site that they were looking at. This is what they were up against. So I just like to always use this photo as a bit of a reminder of exactly what we were doing at the community level. And this was one of 21 different bushfires that had raged across Australia from July 2019. So it wasn't just one bushfire. We were dealing with this for over 6 months, and you can imagine the overall mental health toll that that's taken on not only the first responders, but their family, and then also the wider Australian community. So it's an honour to be able to present on this topic today, and I hope that I do the collective voices of everybody that's been touched by this some justice. So to start off with, I'm sure everybody heard about it in the media. It was an unprecedented bushfire season for us here in Australia. So what do you guys actually need to know about the 2019-2020 Australian bushfires that you might not have already heard about? Well, firstly, as I said, we faced a really devastating start to our fire season back in July 2019, which was very early, and then things swiftly worsened from around January 2020. So I know I also volunteer with the Australian Red Cross here in my state of Victoria. I'm part of their emergency response volunteer group and also the team lead for wellbeing. So we were activated and told very early on, right after Christmas pretty much, that we would be activated and probably activated for quite a while. And to be honest, we were only really deactivated within the past week. So it's been a very long ongoing process for everybody, right through from the emergency services through to the non-governmental organisations, who all came together to play a brilliant and effective overall response to this bushfire crisis. And now obviously we will start to move into the very long-term recovery phase from this. And then at the end of January, we then had the rains that came, and they helped contain the very worst of the fires into February of this year. So as this graph shows, and I think this is always a brilliant image to actually depict just how many fires we were really dealing with. So not all of these were major bushfires, but as you can just see, this is how many fires were spreading right across our nation from the beginning of this year. Dozens of fires erupted in New South Wales and prompted the government there to declare a state of emergency back in November. So it just gives you some sense of how long this has been going on for, the scale of it, and you can potentially start to understand why people were becoming so emotionally and physically exhausted come January and February. And we also saw fires rapidly spread across all states to become some of the most devastating that we've actually had on record. So again, just to give you some scale, some comparison, we had an area 3 times the Amazon, or about the size of South Korea in total, that burned. We had, unfortunately, tragically, 34 people died during the bushfires, including 3 volunteer firefighters from here in Australia and 3 American aerial firefighters who had volunteered their time to come over and join our response efforts. And that was a cumulative grief that was felt Australia and in the United States and indeed worldwide. And it just was a really tragic reminder of just how dangerous these roles are when we're talking about the emergency response to disasters. We had nearly 6,000 buildings destroyed across the country, and that resulted in obviously thousands of homes being lost and hundreds of thousands of Australians were then displaced. So when you look at it from that perspective, if we looked at this internationally, we'd think of it as a humanitarian crisis. But here in our own country, we're pretty resilient, and it was a bushfire and we'll deal with it. But very few of us probably just stopped to think of the magnitude of people who had been directly impacted by these fires in a way unprecedented, even surmounting the impact probably of our Black Saturday bushfires back in 2009. We know that in addition to the human impact, billions of animals perished, and indeed some endangered species may even have been driven into extinction by these fires. And we also know, myself as an asthmatic felt it all too personally, that the air quality dropped to hazardous levels. And this wasn't just felt in the communities that were directly being impacted by the fires. This was a low-lying, heavy smoke had hung over most major cities in Australia for weeks on end. And I've got some images of that coming up soon to just give you that real obvious visual representation of just what everybody was dealing with. In terms of the costs, the estimated cost of dealing with these bushfires is expected to exceed the 4.4 billion Australian dollars that it costed when we went through the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. And in addition to that, the tourism sector really copped this. And a lot of these fires were right through some of the most beautiful, pristine tourist areas, particularly up around New South Wales into the Blue Mountains, and beautiful areas that would generally be full of tourists were directly impacted. Here in Victoria, I personally felt the impact of one of the bushfires that went through one of our beautiful coastal regions of Malick, where around 4,000 people sheltered on the foreshore at the beach where they should have been relaxing, enjoying their Christmas holidays. Now, if you think back to what you were doing on New Year's Eve, many of us were probably getting ready to ring in the new year, making our resolutions for 2020, but those 4,000 people were cowering on the beach, fearing for their lives. And as it approached lunchtime in Victoria, the skies went from a hazy, smoke-coloured sky to pitch black because the smoke became that thick it actually blocked out the sun. These people were surrounded on every front by a ring of fire, and they waded out into the water with their children, with their pets, with whatever they had been able to take from their homes, generally in shopping bags, and they stood out in the water wondering if they were about to die. So you can just imagine that's just one community that was impacted. And that was within the state of Victoria, who then did put out a request for assistance to the national government, and Navy ships were then sent into Malick. But again, that took some time for them to get there. And we started a long, arduous evacuation process. And really, it was interesting to hear the stories filtering through from people who managed to evacuate out of Malick, in terms of you had to be able to actually climb the ropes to get on and off the ships to be able to get on there. So sometimes the elderly and the children were left to be choppered out by air evacuation. But again, being mindful of the very thick smoke haze that hung in the air, many of those choppers that initially tried to reach the area were turned away. So we ended up having many families, particularly with elderly and children, having to stay in place in these beach areas for up to 4 days before many of them could actually evacuate. Those that were lucky enough to get on the Navy ships spent 20 hours evacuating from Malakuta into Melbourne. And then many of those then got off the ship and onto another bus and spent another hour and a half almost coming into one of the major evacuation centres in the central business district of Melbourne. So not surprisingly, by the time they reached us, they were not only physically exhausted, but they were emotionally exhausted. We had pets that were exhausted. We had reunification of families happening. So it was a very emotional, but also very rewarding time for us with all the NGOs and organisations that were part of that effort to meet and greet all of those evacuees coming in. But yes, the impact on the tourism sector has been huge, with resources predicting to have fallen from around 1 billion Australian dollars. So we know that there were dozens of fires erupting in New South Wales, and that was in November, but we also know that they spread rapidly across all the states to become, as I've mentioned, one of the most devastating on record. And if you have a look at this very eerie image that I have here, and there have been so many different versions of this doing the rounds on social media and in mainstream media, but it essentially shows Australia glowing hot red. And it's just such a stark visual reminder for what those of us were actually experiencing here in Australia. So by the 7th of January, the smoke had actually reached right across the South Pacific Ocean to Chile, which is pretty remarkable when you think of that, in terms of the distance that the smoke was going. And so then where did we end up come sort of mid-February? The fires in New South Wales, which was the state in Australia that was most affected, were finally declared contained on the 13th of February. And here you can see a quote from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service Deputy Commissioner Rob Rogers. And he was saying, after what's been a truly devastating fire season for both firefighters and residents who've suffered through so much, we can really now focus on helping people to rebuild. But the relief that came with this sensation of being told, you know what, we're finally in control of this largely, these fires are out, then came one of the wettest weeks that the region had actually seen in 3 decades. So yes, folks, for those of you who don't understand Australia's disaster profile, we can be impacted by bushfires, by floods, by cyclones, by severe storms, by drought, all at the very same time. And that's indeed what we were experiencing in January and February of this year. So New South Wales, they started rejoicing that the fires were indeed out, but then they had this downpour of rain, and people shifted their attention from the devastating bushfires to these torrential downpours. And of course, not surprisingly, then came the floods. So these communities that had just lived through one of the worst crises they'd probably ever experienced in their lifetime now had to deal with another disaster straight on the heels of it. The heavy rains brought welcome relief for the firefighters and the farmers, but not surprisingly, they then sparked flooding throughout some of these regions that led to further scrambled attempts to try to rescue some of our native animals. And I'm sure it probably made its way into the international media as well, that some of our beloved wildlife was devastatingly impacted by these fires. We were inundated with really distressing images of koalas and kangaroos and other wildlife being injured and killed by these fires. We had so many different volunteer organisations, which was fantastic to see, who rallied to go out and search for the wildlife and try to care for and rehabilitate those that have been injured. And of course, that will be an ongoing mission here in Australia. And again, not surprisingly, the mental health burden that had, not just on adults, but for our children who were watching these images coming through. And I think that probably hit home more for the kids than anything else, was that, oh, all these animals had been hurt and lost their homes. And so parents had to figure out ways to have those kinds of discussions with their children around the impact that the fires were having. And in addition to this, these really sudden heavy downpours of rain, particularly in some areas, caused flash flooding, falling trees and landslides where the fires had literally come through and wiped out vegetation. And then there was the smoke. Now, this is an image that I have pilfered from ABC Australia, but I have a number of images very similar on my own camera. This is of my hometown. This is Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. That's the Yarra River there that you can see people canoeing down. It's usually picturesque in January, February, bright blue skies. But this was what we were actually greeted with, not only for a day or two, but for weeks on end. The smoke in the central business district was thick. It hung in the air. For many of us living in high-rise towers, we couldn't see out of our windows. And so the mental health toll that has as well, and any of you who've lived through fires or similar events will understand that you don't need to be directly in communities that have been directly decimated and impacted, but you can be in the regions where the smoke filters to and still have that mental health impact from seeing it. So this smoke was another major health issue as well. On the 1st of January, Australia's capital recorded the worst pollution it's ever seen, and the air quality index was 23 times higher than what's considered hazardous. And smoke in major cities crept into people's homes, their workplaces, schools and shopping centres. You'd go out to do your groceries and you'd come home and your clothes and your hair would smell of smoke. And when you're living with that for weeks on end, it has an impact. We heard out of our nation's capital in Canberra that it also crept into health facilities and even in some areas stopped MRI machines from working. So that's pretty full on. Doctors began to see more and more patients affected by the smoke haze. And again, not surprisingly, people with asthma, lung disease and other respiratory issues were particularly at risk for exacerbations of their illnesses. And we certainly did see spikes in not only doctor presentations, but emergency department presentations at that same time. And the relentless smoke was also making people really anxious. And as I mentioned, there's a very unique toll that disasters like this have on children. And we had children in the city who'd never experienced anything like this before. They didn't live in bushfire-prone regions, so they probably hadn't even really had preparedness talks about what to expect. All of a sudden, they're waking up, they can smell the smoke, they can see it, and they're thinking that the city's on fire. So we had that additional layer of vulnerability that we really had to address. And this image is taken from our Canberra Airport in our capital, and it just shows again, I think visually, just what we were actually dealing with in terms of the thickness of smoke that was hanging in the air. Canberra had the worst air quality of actually all major cities in the world, not just Australia, but the world, outdoing Beijing in China and even New Delhi in India during the bushfire crisis. And the smoke reached all the way to New Zealand. Our Kiwi neighbours across the ditch felt the impact as well. They started to be able to smell it and see it. And that was a reminder for them just what we were dealing with in Australia, because that was 1,000 miles away. So again, in one direction, it had travelled all the way to Chile, and 1,000 miles to the other, it was going directly blanketing our New Zealand neighbours. It impacted businesses and slowly seeped into both our personal and our collective psyche. So along with long-time friend of Wadham, Professor Frederick Skip Burkle Jr., I had the absolute pleasure of writing a piece for The Conversation here in Australia on the 14th of February that was looking at what we term collective trauma. Now, most of us are probably really familiar with the concept of psychological trauma, which is the impact on an individual's psyche caused by being part of an extremely distressing event. But there's also this other kind of trauma which not everybody is fully aware of, and that's a collective disturbance that occurs within a group of people when their world is suddenly upended. And I think a really nice example of this, particularly when I'm teaching my students about collective trauma, is to consider the Buffalo Creek flood of 1972, in which a dam burst at a West Virginian coal mine, which inundated that town and killed 132 people. And when he was visiting the region the year after that disaster, the sociologist Kai Erikson actually noticed that in addition to ongoing personal or individual level trauma, there was this collective trauma that he could see. It appeared that the community as a whole was in a permanent state of shock. And this term collective trauma is certainly gaining prominence in communities and certainly in the media in the wake of these unprecedented Australia bushfire crisis. So what do we actually mean by it and why is it important? Well, it essentially comes from the concept, or the concept itself comes from the work of French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who suggested that our norms and our values and rituals are the foundations of social order, and they provide the basis for our connectedness, our social cohesion, and are probably pillars of what we would now refer to as resilience. And this collective trauma occurs when an unexpected event like this bushfire crisis comes through and damages the ties that bind our community together. And it's really easy to see how a bushfire that comes in and potentially levels communities not only destroys and physically destroys the communities, but also the social ties that work to bond people together. And why is it so important? Because it's those social bonds, that connectedness, that is so important for resilience and so important ultimately for the way that people will recover after disasters. And then it's also really important to have a look at some of the particular people that will be uniquely impacted by disasters like this, particularly from a mental health perspective. And being involved with the Red Cross here in Australia and being so actively involved with emergency services who have large volunteer cohorts for the better part of the past 2 decades, I was super concerned about the well-being of the volunteers who were on the bushfire front lines. And because we knew that even though the smoke was clearing, the direct impact of the bushfires was becoming pretty apparent, but we also know that what wasn't as apparent at that point in time was going to be that mental health impact, not only on the communities, but particularly on the first responders who had been toiling away for weeks, if not months, to try to protect their communities from the onslaught of these fires. And so for those who responded, including thousands of volunteers right across Australia, the psychological trauma can remain long after the physical scars have faded from our land. And so there were lots of images being posted on social media which showed regrowth in these horrible burnt out areas. There were signs of life with green pieces of flora and fauna coming through. But is it as easy for regrowth and that sort of recovery to happen for people, particularly from a mental health perspective? And I think it's sometimes easy to get lost and forget about the true impact that our volunteers have. We know that they're pivotal to mounting an effective and sustainable response to disasters, particularly on a scale like this. And I like to think of them as the glue that's really needed to support both response capacity, but also to empower communities in times of relief and recovery. And so if we think back to July 2019, which is when these fires started, so we've been dealing with them again for coming up to 7 months, thousands and thousands of volunteers have been deployed during that period right across Australia in many disaster affected communities. Some do an incredible job fighting fires, repairing damage, or distributing food, water, and other essential supplies. Others are going to go into communities and play really important roles in caring for the well-being of other people. But who's caring for the well-being of them? And that's an issue that I've been incredibly focused on it and really passionate about in terms of finding the best ways to actually provide well-being. And so that led into another article that I wrote in the conversation, but was really hoping to share that with the broader community so that people would be aware. They would see the first responders and people in uniform going in, and they were all heroes, but there were so many other people that were part of this collective response to disasters. But in terms of well-being, how do we best approach that? We certainly know historically, and that's one thing I learned from the research that I've done with the responders, first responders from the 9/11 terrorist attacks, that responders can sometimes be a little bit hesitant to reach out for support. They often feel like, you know, they put on a uniform, they do this role, they should be able to deal with it. I'm fine, there are other people that are worse off than me. Even when they do decide that they need help, they often tend to delay for quite lengthy periods of time before they actually seek support. After 9/11, within the cohort of medics that I was following, it was sometimes 5 to 10 years after the terrorist attacks that they finally started to get proper mental health support for a range of conditions, including PTSD, anxiety, and depression. But you guys in the United States are certainly not alone. When I speak to our first responders here in Australia, we see similar things. And so many of the people that I work with here in Victoria through the Code 9 Foundation, which is a charity that was set up to actually assist current and veteran first responders and our emergency telecommunications operators who have mental health conditions that directly result from their service to the community. And when I talk to some of our members, they say the same thing. They knew that they weren't right, but they took a long time to actually speak about that, to acknowledge that, maybe even to really recognize in themselves that it wasn't just normal, that this had become an abnormal, prolonged response to what they had gone through. And so they needed to seek support. But again, some of them were waiting years and years. And even the founder and president of our foundation, Mark Thomas, who is still currently serving within the Victoria Police here, he talks quite openly about he had probably had PTSD for about 10 years before he had a panic attack halfway up Mount Everest. And that literally forced him to stop and acknowledge what was going on. So what is the problem? How can we get better support in terms of wellbeing for our first responders and our volunteers? I think firstly, we need to acknowledge that it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one service won't necessarily work for another. What works for men might not necessarily work the same way for women. I think here in Australia, when I started doing a little bit of investigation into this, it seemed that overwhelmingly the majority of our wellbeing frameworks were really founded on this concept of resilience, which is great. We talk about resilience a lot and with good cause. It generally promotes a positive sense of wellbeing, and our inner resilience helps us cope. But it can also have negative consequences. So we quite often talk about bending but not breaking when it comes to resilience. But what happens when we do break? What happens when we do feel broken? Does that mean we're not resilient? And what are the mental health ramifications of that, of potentially labeling ourselves of, well, I feel really broken, so obviously I'm not resilient, and therefore, what's the flow-on effect from that? So I've been talking about for some time now that we really need models and frameworks for wellbeing that still encourage people to reach out. And we have fantastic initiatives here in Australia like the Are You OK Day, which really encourage people to talk about mental health and to normalise conversations around that, and to help break down the existing stigma that's still there when it comes to talking about our mental health. But we need more. We can't always wait for people to reach out. I know when I've felt broken, when I've been in crisis situations, sometimes I can't even pick up the phone to ring my loved ones and my friends, let alone ringing a stranger at the end of an employee assistance line, for example. So we need to also have a layer built into our wellbeing and support frameworks that encourages ways for emergency services, organisations, communities and families to reach in. So we can start to identify people who might be struggling, and instead of waiting for them when they're at the bottom of the hole to try to climb out and ask for help, we can jump into the hole with them and help lift them out. And I think that's a really important area that we need to start considering further. One of the programs I love to highlight is that of the Ambulance Victoria's Peer Support Dog Program. I think they are an amazing example of how we can not only encourage people to reach out when they need to, but reaching in. And that's an amazing initiative where, say if a crew has been out to a particularly bad job, or they might have had a run of pretty terrible jobs, they will actually send a paramedic peer support person to that station, or out to the branch, or out to the hospital where this crew might still be after a long job, and they will turn up with their beautiful dogs. And these dogs are their own personal pets who have been put through a stringent training process and have been culled down to 12. We have 12 amazing dogs here in Victoria that are part of Ambulance Victoria's Peer Support Dog Program. And when you talk to the peer support providers, they say we could turn up at branches, we could turn up at hospitals, and the paramedics wouldn't want to talk to us. If anything, they might sometimes try to avoid us. But as soon as you turn up with a dog, they'll be down on the ground, rolling around, hugging, taking photos with it. And it's amazing how easily the discussion then flows because the dog is there. And quite often, people will actually say, you know, that's all I needed. I've had a hug, I've had a play with the dog. It's lifted my spirits. I'm right now. I can keep going. And so I really like to encourage you all to look that up on the internet. There's some remarkable work being done by the Ambulance Victoria peer support team. And just as I realise we're sort of coming towards the end of the webinar, but I just wanted to highlight that, you know, we're just coming out of the end of this devastating bushfire crisis. And then, like everyone else in the world, Australians are now dealing with the looming threat of a coronavirus pandemic. And I'm not sure if this is happening where you're living or if media from Australia has reached you, but here in Australia, we're unfortunately currently seeing really fear-induced mass buying, particularly of toilet paper. And that picture there you can see of two gentlemen queued up at Costco with more toilet paper that I don't know how they would ever need that much, where they're going to store that at home. But we are certainly seeing this real, what the media are terming panic buying. And I don't really like the term panic myself. I think the evidence overwhelmingly tells us that people don't generally panic when it comes to disasters. And we certainly saw that after disasters like 9/11, for example, where that evacuation out of both of those towers was markedly quite, civil and calm. But we are seeing fear-driven responses here in Australia at the moment, and it has resulted in all of our supermarkets across the country pretty much having empty shelves at the moment when it comes to toilet paper, hand sanitizers, and tissues. Some of that fear has come from reports that a lot of our supply comes from China, and yes, that manufacturing has been impacted by the virus. But we need to remind people here in Australia particularly that over 60% of our supply is actually made domestically. So we're probably not likely to run out. But for whatever reason, people have it in their heads that they're going to run out of loo paper. And so, yes, it's become a bit of a crisis, and it's been the focus of the majority of media requests and interviews that I've been dealing with over the past couple of days, in that, is it an irrational response or is it a normal part of what we're currently dealing with? And I think it's a little bit of both. I think here in Australia, we're in that very unique position of being still so impacted by the bushfire crisis. We probably haven't even seen the main mental health toll play out from that yet. And now all of a sudden we're expecting people to turn around and face another disaster head on. And particularly pandemics, we know, are very frightening. They're unfamiliar. They're high on the level for risk and people's own perceptions of fear. So we need to address that. And the way I keep trying to talk about this in the media is saying we are going to have people have these kind of reactions. They are normal reactions to very abnormal situations that we currently find ourselves within. But the antidote to that fear is action. we need to give people really reasonable and sensible actions that they can be undertaking to feel like they're actually proactively looking after themselves, their families, and preparing for the potential crisis that's coming. So some of the things I've been talking about in the media recently are around, yes, it's sensible to do some stockpiling, but you probably don't need to have 20 odd packets of loo paper. You can start thinking about when you're cooking your weekly meals, maybe make a little bit extra each time and freeze those and put them aside, because a lot of the media is putting out lists at the moment of what people should have in their pantries. And here in Melbourne, in our Herald Sun, we had a list come out today that said for a basic family of 4, you need to have 8 kilos of pasta, equivalent of rice, pasta sauces, jams, Nutellas, peanut butters, cereals, lots of good staples. But we also need to remind people that if you're going to be in quarantine, think practically. You're probably also going to want a couple of things that make you feel good. So for me, it's the chocky and the Diet Coke. My husband doesn't think he could get through quarantine without a couple of bags of frozen dim sims, which for anyone out of Australia, you might not understand, but it's disgusting. It's basically who knows what in a little parcel that they deep fry, and it's gross. But my husband loves them, and he also wants to make sure he has beer available. So again, it goes back to that difference between men and women and different families. I don't think there's going to be one list that will suit everybody, but we can sensibly start to think about what our family would need to be able to cope if one or more of them ended up being quarantined for a period of 14 days once the pandemic really takes off. But again, this much toilet paper, probably not necessary. So look, I'd like to leave you with one final thought, and it's something that I've certainly learnt over the past months dealing with the bushfire crisis, the floods. During that time, we also have cyclones threatening our northern states. And now we've got this bug that not only is creeping over our borders, but pretty soon will probably start to sprint in and really cause mass human-to-human transmission in our communities. But a lot of it comes down to our perspective. We can choose to feel educated and prepared and in control. That might not always be the case. We might often be impacted by things that we don't prepare for and don't plan for. But so much of it comes down to our perspective on things. And I saw this circulated yesterday and I loved it. So I just thought I would leave you all with that final thought that, yes, it's all about the way that we actually look at it. So I thank you all so much for your attention and for taking part in today's webinar. And I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have.
Oh, Erin, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I always love your insights. I always think they're sensible and common sense and just with the right amount of humour.
Thanks, Sally.
So for everybody, I'll now open up the webinar for questions. If you have a look next to your name, you'll see that there's, you can see that you're on mute and well, actually there's 5 symbols. There's a mute, and then I think it's a camera, a triangle, a question, and a hand. If you click on the hand, I can see that you've got a question, and then I'll unmute your microphone, and looks like Norm might have a question, but then we've been talking, well, you've been talking, Erin, so it might be about that. Okay, so Charles has a question. So Charles, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute your microphone, and then please ask Erin your question. Over. Go, Charles.
Greetings from the state of Michigan in the United States. I just wanted to send a shout out of thanks to everybody in Australia. We lost 3 Americans. I don't know, it brought a tear to my eye because I'm a veteran corpsman in the Navy, that the 3 men who came back to us were given honors on the tarmac. And I gotta say, you guys are really resilient in Australia. We've been praying for you. And to find out that 3 koala bears were named after these guys, you know, it shows the humanity of the disaster. And, you know, I just wanted to thank you guys for that.
Thank you so much for those reflections. I absolutely agree that when you said it, it shows humanity. And I think we often hear about disasters showing both the worst and the best of humanity. It was really interesting here in Australia. There were glimpses of, you know, times when we would have preferred people maybe to behave in different ways, and we can certainly take lessons from that. For example, we had mass media coverage about how the Australian Red Cross were managing donations. And I know you guys there in the United States have dealt with that with the United States Red Cross as well. And it's always going to be normal for people to have questions about where their donations are going. At our core here in Australia, we're incredibly generous and resilient, and there were massive donations made. One of our celebrities here in Australia, Celeste Barber, managed to raise over $50 million through her Facebook and Instagram accounts alone. So it just shows there was an outpouring of people who wanted to help, but then there was misinformation and shared widely and disseminated not only through the mainstream media but on social media, saying that the Red Cross were holding on to those distributions and donations and not giving them out. And it was really interesting to see this wave of hate and resentment that was generated throughout Australia against the Red Cross. And while that was largely directed at the organisation and largely based on misinformation, because in fact they were handing out over $1 million worth of funding in grants every day, it really flowed onto our volunteers on the ground. They were spat at, they were abused, they were assaulted. We had bomb threats. We had to shut down opportunity shops here and send volunteers home. And that side of disaster is really disheartening. So it was really lovely, like you mentioned, to see, as tragic as it was, we lost 3 of our own volunteer firefighters, and then to lose those 3 amazing volunteers that had come over from the United States. There was an absolute outpouring of grief and, you know, people coming together after we saw that, and to have the koalas named after them, I thought, I agree, I was pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful story. Erin, we have another person wanting to ask you a question. So it's Alison Paul. Alison, I'm just having trouble unmuting you. So if you just hold on. Oh, there you go. You should be right to answer a question now. Thank you, Charles.
Hi. Yeah, no, thank you. And while the invitation did say that Alison should not share out the invite, she did share it with me. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it. My name's Sarah Sargent. I'm from the Canadian Red Cross. And thank you for this opportunity. My question is really recognizing some of the similarities between the context of events in Australia as well as Canada, and just the remote communities, and looking at the provision of support for individuals within remote settings and how you approach that, whether it was through opportunities for direct service provision, but then the use of technology. And if I could ask you, if you can, add to that how this looks and what you found to be some best practice in terms of supporting Indigenous populations in Australia.
Amazing questions there, and I will be the first to admit they're not really my areas of expertise. So I would hate to sort of give you an answer that said this is what we did, and I'm sure there was a lot more happening. As you point out, disaster preparedness, response and recovery in rural, regional and remote areas can be more problematic, and reaching those areas in terms of even public health education, disseminating information physically and just logistically, there are major issues there that are very unique to each type of region. We have such a vast difference in geographical and climate conditions across our country as well. So as I mentioned, while some parts of our country were experiencing drought, others were experiencing bushfire, while others were experiencing flood. At the same time, we had cyclones coming. So I think overall, we tend to have that inner resilience growing up in a climate region like we have, but it can be difficult to address all of those different disaster threats that are occurring around the country at the same time. One thing that does come to mind is that probably one of the best radio interviews I have ever done came from this very small little Indigenous group right up in northern Queensland while I was right in the middle of the bushfire crisis. And usually, you know, you dial into interviews and they introduce you and they tell you where you're from, and they'll have questions. And it was probably the most casual, hilarious, yet personally moving interview that I've ever done, because all they were really interested in was what was happening to the animals. Who was going to come and help the animals? Who's going to come and actually get all the bodies of these animals, and what are we going to do with them? And it threw me because I hadn't prepared for those kind of questions. I hadn't had them from anybody else, any other radio or print media request, but it just showed that each of these regions, rural and remote particularly, will have their own unique needs. And I think when it comes down to preparedness, we just need to be so mindful of what those unique needs are and what people are going to need and want to help their resilience after these disasters. So I apologise, I know I haven't totally answered your question. I'm happy to try to look up some further information and send it through to you though.
Thanks, Erin. Look, I just think that's a really important point, because whenever we go, you know, as first responders or people that respond to disasters, I think it's always really important to actually take the time to understand what the needs of the community are and not assume that we know what those needs are. So even though I'm hearing you saying that you don't feel that you answered the question, I do think that's really the essence of, you know, listening to the community and understanding what their needs are.
Yeah.
I'll stop. We have another question. This is great, people. Keep them coming. Sarah Meehan is ready to ask you a question. And Sarah, I've unmuted your mic.
Thank you. Hi, Erin. I'm calling from Colorado, and I'm working on an article for publichealthdegrees.org about the mental health effects of natural disasters. And I'm wondering if you could offer any advice for folks like locally and globally who want to support people who are coping with mental health issues following disasters. It seems like it's pretty easy for people to donate to organizations like the Red Cross who provide physical assistance, but what about organizations that support mental health after these sorts of events?
Yeah, a really interesting question. Thank you so much. And I think it's something that I've been grappling with from the perspective of my role with the Red Cross, and just in terms of wellbeing and how we support not only people in the community, but also the volunteers themselves. So there are so many aspects of wellbeing that are going to be incredibly important to recognise and monitor following these bushfires. I think when you talk about the really local level, it's in terms of, you know, businesses and organisations can help at the practical level by simply identifying who has actually been directly impacted and what can we do to assist those employees. Have they lost their home? Have they been displaced? Is there something that we can physically do to help them? More broadly, how can we provide additional assistance to people during these tricky times? We know traditionally that people don't really utilise EAPs or employee assistance programs as much as we would like. So we need to supplement, like they are a very important thing to have, but we need to supplement them with approaches that both educate and encourage people to reach out when they need help, but to also look at initiatives, as I mentioned, that reach in. So how can we identify people who are struggling? We can do that at our family unit level, within our friendship networks, within sporting clubs, within volunteer groups, within any kind of network that we have. We can just start checking in on people, asking how you're doing, particularly those that we notice aren't behaving the way they usually do, or we just notice a sustained difference in the way they are. It doesn't hurt to ask, are you okay? And the next important step is how to have that conversation, because one thing I often talk about is it's okay and it's great to say, are you okay? But then you need to actually stop and be present and listen to their response. Because quite often they won't need you to give advice. They won't need you to tell them what to do. Sometimes they just need someone to sit with them and be present and listen. And that's really helpful in itself. But I think at the global level as well, it's again identifying how we can best, you know, develop initiatives that reach in and identify people before they fall in the hole, but also identify people who are already in the hole and we can help to pull out instead of waiting for them to try to reach out themselves and get out on their own. Because we know once people are already in a crisis, it's a lot harder to actually ask for help. But if you have someone sitting next to you saying, how are you going? You know, what do you need? What can we do? That actually makes people feel seen and feel heard and goes a long way to helping with mental health.
Thank you, Erin. We now have, and Sarah, we now have a question from John Richardson. John, I'm just, again, attempting to unmute you. Hang on. Oh, there you go. Go for it.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Erin, for a great presentation. Again, it's John Richardson here from Red Cross in Australia. A couple of things. Just wanted to sort of reflect on Sarah's question. I know that there are a couple of great conversation articles that might be worth having a look at, which looked at sort of the Indigenous or First Nations impacts, and I know this is something that we're certainly looking at, sort of going into the recovery, sort of long-term recovery within Red Cross. We're looking at sort of what we can do to support communities. The conversation is fantastic, and those articles, Erin, that you've written have been brilliant. So I think, you know, just it's such a great source of information that's obviously based on peer-reviewed evidence, which I think is fantastic. Question is, I guess, for Erin, for you, is to sort of thinking forward and mindful of the work that you've done on, so, you know, long-term impacts on particularly responders, but I guess more broadly, I'm just wondering whether you've got any reflections on, given the complex and sort of collective trauma nature of what we've seen over the summer, whether you've got any sort of reflections on how this might play out over years. So I'm not just thinking about months, but over years.
Yeah, great question, John. And I think that's one thing for us all to be mindful of, is that the mental health impact of the bushfire crisis is going to play out over years. We are still seeing the impact from the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires here in Australia, for example. So this is going to be a long-term process. It's not going to be something that will be over and done with within a matter of weeks or months. And what I've learned from the long-term follow-ups that I have done is that sometimes those true mental health impacts won't even manifest for 5 or so years down the track. So people might be travelling along quite well in those initial first few years after disaster. They might be able to distract themselves and, you know, be engaging in activities that help them sort of, you know, bubble along quite nicely, but then there might be a one-off trigger event, or just the cumulative nature of what they've dealt with. It might be, for example, if they're first responders, that they go out and they hear a particular sound or smell a particular smell that will trigger a memory, and that might be what brings on their mental health condition or injury. I know we're having lots of debate here in Australia at the moment around whether it should be PTSD or PTSI. So I think one of the things that I would like to highlight is being mindful of our need to follow up long term, and not just the first responders, but the volunteers and the communities themselves. How we go about doing that is interesting. Whether we, you know, are able to get, you know, for us in terms of academia and research, there are so many things we would love to do, but trying to get access to various groups and follow them up long term can sometimes be problematic. That's where I think groups like the Australian Red Cross, other NGOs, they're in a unique position, because you guys can actually be following up your cohort of volunteers long term. We should be taking baseline measurements now to ask people, how are you doing? And then go back, and it doesn't have to be as long term as what I did with 9/11, where I did it at 5-year milestones. It could be at 3-monthly or 6-monthly milestones over the next couple of years, just to track and see how people are doing. Because I think it's so important for people to know that once the media pack up and go home and the emergency response phase is over, that they haven't been forgotten, and that the impacts can truly linger and may not actually truly be felt for years. So I think what you've mentioned is really important, and it's a huge part of my passion in terms of well-being moving forward.
Thanks, Erin. Look, it's getting on to 10 o'clock, but we have one more hand up. So I think we'll make this the last question, but I just want to thank everybody for their fantastic participation. Edward Malick has a question, and Edward, I'm just trying to unmute you. So I'm just, if you can just hold on. Not sure why I'm having so much trouble with this. We just need elevator music or something. Erin, I'm going to ask a question while I'm trying to unmute Edward really quickly.
Okay.
Why do you reckon that all the, you know, I watch the ABC in the morning or, you know, other news channels, but everyone's talking about washing hands with antibacterial gel, whereas, you know, I've always been taught as a registered nurse that washing hands with soap and water is adequate. Do you have any take on that? And Edward, I'm trying to get to you.
Yeah, no, I think I have a couple of reflections. I am constantly at my husband to wash his hands. So I think it's just this inbuilt almost laziness where people don't take the time to wash their hands with soap and water. It's also the convenience of having hand sanitizers in our bags sometimes that just makes it easier to do that, and perhaps not being mindful that using those hand sanitizers isn't actually as effective as a good old scrub with soap and water. So I think whenever these kind of disasters loom, like pandemics, it's so important to remind people of the basic hygiene measures that they can be taking that will be one of their best protective measures against it. So wash your hands with soap and water, stop touching your face. Yes, hand sanitizers are useful, but don't rely on them. And, you know, just use common sense.
Yeah. Well, Edward, I really apologise. I don't know why I'm not able to unmute you. I'm just quickly seeing if Edward can type in his question for you. But if not, we might need to leave it there.
If anyone wants to email me directly any questions or have a chat afterwards, I'm more than happy to, Ali. So.
Okay. Well, I just want to.
Can you hear me now? It's Edward.
Yeah.
Yes. Hello.
Oh, it all of a sudden worked. Thank you very much, Erin. I'll be quick. I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you for your presentation and your understanding of the process. I'm from Canada and I work for the federal government, and my responsibility is with animal health diseases. And it's the reaching. I like your reaching in process, and we'll be using that in my future presentations. I did present at the WADM Toronto meeting on animal health emergencies, and look forward to talking to you further.
Fantastic. Thank you for that feedback.
Oh, look, I just want to thank Erin for giving such a fantastic talk this morning. And I also want to thank all of you, the attendees as well, for really making this webinar a really interactive session. Remember that we record these webinars. We'll be putting it up on the website, and so you can revisit it if you like. And we did have a question earlier on about whether or not WADM gives out what we call in Australia CPD points. In America, I think it's CE or CEU points, and we will be investigating that. I think that's a really good question, and it's something that I think we can endeavour to work out how we might be able to go about that. So watch this space. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, Erin, and have a great day. See you later.